Final Fantasy games are notorious for being packed full of various unique and memorable bosses. Many of these bosses are incredibly well designed, but every now and again, some slip through the cracks and are just simply unfair. Sometimes these bosses expect players to have knowledge they couldn't possibly have had on a first blind playthrough, and in these instances, walking into a boss fight with the wrong build can be utterly devastating. Such instances require players to go back to the drawing board, but sometimes this still isn't even enough. There are plenty of instances where even a fully prepared party will have a low chance of success due to the mechanics of the boss fight itself, and there have even been examples of where unfair bosses expected players to push the limits of what is physically possible. In this video, we're going to cover 7 of the cheapest Final Fantasy bosses who didn't play by the rules. Now, unfortunately, there are quite a few examples of unfair bosses throughout the franchise. So many in fact that this is our 3rd video on the topic. As per usual though, within this self-contained iteration of the series, we are only going to feature one boss per game. And we're going to start things off with a boss from one of the most notoriously unfair games in the franchise, Gafgarian from Final Fantasy Tactics. Tactics is a beloved entry in the Final Fantasy franchise, and it was so successful upon launch that it spawned an entire branch of tactics games that players would enjoy for years. But outside of its commendable sales efforts and incredible lore, Tactics has also become notorious for its punishing gameplay loops, which penalises players for making bad choices, especially when it comes to the use of their save states. Throughout the game, there are numerous instances where players can become save-locked, forced to square off against bosses they have no hope of beating due to a combination of being underleveled or having the completely wrong setup. And one of those instances happened when Ramza had to square off against Gafgarian at Lionel Castle Gate. This particular fight was intended to be a duel, with Ramza fighting Gafgarian alone while the rest of the party dealt with a group of normal enemies. This worked great narratively, but it could be problematic for Ramza if he didn't have a job that was well suited for a one-on-one duel against a powerful melee boss. Although it was possible for Ramza to interact with a switch to open the gate that separated him from the rest of the party, Gafgarian was so strong that it was easy for him to incapacitate Ramza before even making it to the gate switch, unless the party had access to a special movement ability like teleport. Those who were unprepared could feel quite overwhelmed by the situation, but there were a few strategies that could be applied to make things a bit easier, and perhaps the most useful was debilitating Gafgarian's use of weaponry somehow, either by stealing it or breaking it. To give general survivability in the wider melee, players could also equip the team with rubber shoes, as the majority of enemies were using lightning elemental weapons. But even with these advantages, the fight could still be pretty brutal. Final Fantasy IX featured a story that masterfully weaved together complex themes, even going so far as to tackle existential dread through the inclusion of Vivi. Throughout, there were also moments of real tension, and one such instance occurred when the game introduced a 30-minute time limit for the party when they were attempting to rescue Princess Garnet from the basement of Alexandria Castle. During this mad rush to find Princess Garnet, players could examine a bookcase in the library to encounter the optional boss called Tantarian. Tantarian has become notorious because it placed the player in what felt like an impossible situation. Any time spent fighting the boss chipped away at the limited time available to actually try and find and then save Princess Garnet. The other cheap aspect was that Tantarian was designed for players to tackle later on in the game when they came back to Alexandria and were more appropriately leveled. It meant during this initial period, the boss had a relatively high level, and players who went in blind wouldn't have been aware of this on their first playthrough, which meant they could potentially spend a lot of time trying to optimally take down the boss while making sure there was still enough time left to save the princess. What's more, Tantarian used a unique mechanic where it hid in the pages of a book, only revealing itself to players if they dealt a specific amount of damage. While in the book, Tantarian also took less damage and could cast more powerful spells like Doom, which could easily wipe the party. Now, in our previous video on this topic, we featured Seymour Flux. The fight, which took place atop Mount Gugazet, has become one of the most notorious due to how unfair Seymour was and the emotional weight behind it. But Seymour Flux is not alone when it comes to Final Fantasy X, as there are plenty of other cheap bosses. And that means it's time to turn the spotlight back onto Yunalesca. A big part of the challenge when fighting Yunalesca was that she took advantage of zombie mechanics in a way that decimated unprepared parties. And it was very easy to be unprepared when fighting Yunalesca, given that a party with no resistance to zombie was just as susceptible to defeat as a party with full resistance to zombie. Perhaps the worst aspect was that Yunalesca conditioned the player over multiple phases. It meant many unsuspecting players with a fully cleansed party were susceptible to having their entire party wiped by Megadeath at the start of Phase 3, as they would have no way of knowing the spell was coming. What made this all the more frustrating was that should Yunalesca succeed, not only would the boss need to be fought again, but players were required to watch a long and drawn-out cutscene each and every time they lost the fight. This could lead to individual attempts taking over half an hour for players, especially those who struggled with the third phase of the fight. Now, Yunalesca is just one of a number of antagonists who lived up to their hype when faced as a boss. And in a weird way, it often feels good to see a villain built up throughout an entire game who then displays the true scope of their power during a fated confrontation. The ones that manage this, such as Kefka, end up going down in Final Fantasy history as truly imposing foes, and Golbez also falls into this category, even though his display of power came through in a way that was cheaper than most. During the boss fight, Golbez used an ability called Binding Cold, which applied paralysis to each party member. He then summoned the Shadow Dragon, which used an ability called Black Fang, instantly killing each member of the party, aside from Cecil. Once everyone but Cecil was dead, Rydia appeared to take care of the Shadow Dragon and remove Cecil's paralysis. At this point, the fight would proceed like any normal one. However, the fight against Golbez didn't always work out this way. If players entered the fight with Cecil already defeated from the previous battle against Calcabrina, Golbez could almost instantly wipe the entire party. If he used Binding Cold and summoned the Shadow Dragon while Cecil was still downed, the party was simply defeated without Rydia ever showing up to save the day. This was very cheap, given that it could easily catch an unsuspecting player off guard and force them to redo not only the fight against Golbez, but also the previous fight against Calcabrina. It's evident that when Square Enix was developing Final Fantasy XV, they were still trying to figure out how to make an engaging and balanced action-heavy Final Fantasy game. The mechanics could sometimes leave fights feeling imbalanced, either because they were too easy or too hard. This became more apparent in the late and post-game, where encounters started to get a bit more complex. There were a handful of super bosses that players could challenge during the latter parts of the game, and although the Adamantoise is likely the most well-known, Omega, which was introduced via the Royal Edition, is arguably much more unfair. Omega had a 99% resistance to normal weapons, which meant the player needed to overcome the super boss using the Royal Arms, which drained Noctis's HP. The regular HP drain was made even more unfair given Omega's attacks naturally did extremely high damage to the player. This alone was bad, but Omega could also use attacks that reduced the party's maximum HP, which could lead to a situation where Omega's normal attacks were enough to one-shot party members. Altogether, this created a need for the player to constantly heal throughout the fight, making it harder to find time to actually deal damage than in a typical encounter. Omega also played unfair though, in that it tempted players into attacking its antenna to speed up the encounter, as its antenna took double damage. Unfortunately, falling for this ruse meant Omega would become berserked, which altered its attack patterns and increased its attack speed, making it even harder for players to survive. Even if players avoided attacking the antenna though, and managed to get Omega's health down to 50%, its attack speed increased anyway. It also began to target party members with an attack which inflicted the vulnerable status. Once afflicted, Omega repeatedly targeted the party member for 20 seconds with a special beam attack that instantly killed its target. After everything the player had gone through to get to the halfway mark of the fight against Omega, this meant should they fall foul to that beam attack, all their progress could be taken away in an instant. Final Fantasy VII is known for introducing a large number of iconic antagonists to the franchise as a whole. Sephiroth alone has transcended Final Fantasy and found his way into plenty of other properties. And while Rufus may not be quite so well known, he is well known for being someone with a contingency plan. Unfortunately for players, Rufus stayed true to this identity during his boss fight in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. A boss fight which was made all the more difficult given that Cloud had to face Rufus alone. Rufus automatically countered all of Cloud's attacks in most situations. The only way to reliably get around this was to attack Rufus at the end of his combos while he was reloading. Unfortunately, if Cloud got hit during any of Rufus's combos, then he reloaded while Cloud was recovering from the stagger, and Cloud therefore missed the window of opportunity. This was made particularly challenging by Rufus mixing and matching the specific moves he used in his combos, and the order in which they were used. All of his moves were also fast-paced and required Cloud to react in a different way with different timing, so he could easily catch the player off guard. If the player managed to evade a full combo though, there was a very tight window where Rufus was actually reloading, so the player had to be positioned close enough to Rufus to make sure their hits actually counted. As challenging as the fight against Rufus was already though, after receiving enough damage, Darkstar joined the encounter, turning the fight into a 2-on-1. Darkstar running around meant that the timing windows for dodging Rufus's attacks and hitting Rufus were even harder to maintain, as you also had to account for what Darkstar was doing. And let's not even talk about how everything gets ramped up when playing on hard difficulty, as it's more akin to the kind of boss fight you'd expect from Elden Ring. Fortunately, Rufus does have a weakness though, status effects, and if you're able to take advantage of this weakness, then the entire encounter becomes a lot less stressful. That then brings us onto our final entry, Pandemonium Warden. Final Fantasy XI launched as the first mainline MMO in the franchise, offering players the ability to explore a vast world structured in a very different way from the more linear single-player entries. And this world would only grow over time following the release of numerous expansions. Being an MMO, Final Fantasy XI naturally incorporated raid bosses into its world, the type of bosses that required many players to band together to fight in order to their high difficulty. Bosses of this caliber traditionally required a fully prepared high-level team of coordinated players willing to work together for a long period of time. But Pandemonium Warden, in its initial form at least, was quite different from other raid bosses, and it made headlines due to how brutal it was. Not only did Pandemonium Warden have a high HP pool, it could assume the identity of many of the expansion's other high notorious monsters, each of which had its own quirks. And each of these forms would need to be defeated before defeating Pandemonium Warden itself. It meant the challenge was very high, but that didn't stop a group of ambitious high-level players from attempting to claim victory. A group ran an 18-hour attempt against the boss shortly after release, with the attempt having to be called off due to some players reportedly fainting and vomiting during their 18 hours of uninterrupted high-speed gaming. This prompted Square Enix to release a statement about the incident, and they subsequently adjusted Pandemonium Warden so that it would despawn after 2 hours should it not be defeated in that window. But with that, they were 7 more of the cheapest Final Fantasy bosses from across the entire franchise. Be sure to let us know in the comments below which of these you found frustrating and cheap, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent and Sukun DDK who are super special Onion supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.